Niharika Hema Raj, then you are quite sure that a topic will be niche. That's what I was talking to her before going live. Today's topic is quite fascinating. False memories and criminal trials. Time for an update. Today we have a parallel session with our dear friends also on a constitutional basic structure. Be that as it may, with our normal practice, we are going ahead with the session on the weekend part. Tomorrow we will be having on Indus Water Treaty. That will also again be an interesting topic. Over to you, ma'am, and thank you for accepting our invite. Unmute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I want to begin with something you've probably experienced yourself, right? Have you ever been absolutely sure about something, like a conversation, a small event, or anything of that nature, where you kept thinking, like, I know this happened, and then found out later you were wrong? Now, this could be something very small, like leaving your keys somewhere, or like if you've closed the door, locked it, etc. So you would think, okay, I have kept my keys in this very specific place, only to find out later that it was actually in your bag. Or maybe it was something more serious, like a fight with a loved one, where both of you were absolutely convinced that you remembered things differently. So now imagine this: what if someone's life depended on your memory? Or they're not just daily plans, their whole life. What if your memory was being used in a courtroom? What if a person's future depended entirely on what you remembered? So, that is the unsettling but important question that we're going to explore today. Can memory be trusted the way criminal trials treat it? So, in India and around the world, courts rely heavily on memory. Eyewitness accounts, witness statements, depositions, confessions, all kinds of things. Now, obviously, there are other differences and nuances within them. I'm not looking at them at the moment. I'm just going to be talking about eyewitness accounts in general, or even the procedure of evidence collection itself at that point, wherever memory comes into picture. So, memory often forms the very foundation of justice, right? We can say that in the present context. But science and increasingly real world experience suggests that memory might not be flawless, a reliable recorder we wish it was. So we tend to think of memory as something accurate. Let's look at Sterling testimony, for example, the way that that's looked at by the courts. We tend to think of memory as something real, something honorable, unless established otherwise, right? But today, we're going to take a journey. We'll walk through scientific studies, real court cases, familiar stories from our own popular culture, and comparative practices around the world, because science and increasingly real world experience suggests that memory might not be flawless. It has certain problems. Now we're going to look at that. So at the end of this journey, I hope you'll join me in asking, not accusingly, not disrespectfully, but gently and thoughtfully, is it time for an update? Okay, so we're going to start with that. So let's begin at the very beginning. What exactly is a false memory? Let's start there. So simply put, a false memory is when a person remembers something vividly, emotionally, but the memory is either wrong or it did not happen at all. Now, it's very important to be clear here, because false memory is not a lie. False memory is not lying. The person recalling is not trying to cheat or deceive you. They sincerely believe it happened the way they remember it. I want you to remember the example I gave you at the start of this discussion. That is, when two people remember the exact same incident in two different ways, or you remember something like you put something somewhere, or you saved something somewhere and it's not there and you find it somewhere else. So, that type of distortion is what we're going to talk about today, more or less. So, it's this sincerity with false memories, that you believe it to be true, that makes it so dangerous. Because in a courtroom, sincerity is often equated with truth, right? But what science shows us is that memory, unlike what we see in movies, is not a perfect recording. It's more like a living document, if you can call it that. It's rewritten every time we retrieve it. You can even think of an example of writing in an exam. If you were to reproduce a paragraph and then you come back home and you try that to write that same answer again, will you be able to write it in the exact same way as you wrote it in your exam paper? It's unlikely unless you learned something by heart, right? Even then, you might get it wrong. So let's look at that. So every time we remember something, we may add new details or forget old ones, or even unintentionally reshape the entire story based on what we heard, felt, or believed later. You often see how news, like when you see it on TV, might come up with different versions of the same story. We can look at any examples like that. So false memories. Now let's look at how false memories form. Okay. So false memories form through very ordinary processes. One is suggestion from others, like police officers, therapists, even well meaning parents. Stress and trauma, which can scramble how time, events, are encoded into memory. Time, which erodes accuracy and forces the brain to fill in gaps. Social pressure, when we unconsciously adopt other stories into our own. So none of this would require any malicious intent. It's just how human brains work. So this is something that can happen over time. Like we can look at even children to understand when this happens. Like for example, if you're really stressed, you may experience difficulties in memory. Now imagine crimes where a really stressful event is occurring and somebody is there. This person might be known to that person. Person might be a stranger, but this experience itself or experiencing a crime in any case is stressful. So there is stress and trauma there. And usually, when do these persons testify in court? Much later, right? Much later. So by then, time is also a factor. So which erodes accuracy and forces the brain to fill in those gaps. And during this time, what are we exposed to? Media. We're exposed to suggestion from the media, or maybe even police officers who are genuinely investigating our case, our friends, other witnesses, different people. So these are all aspects that can affect memory. Like I said, suggestion from others, stress and trauma, time, and social pressure. So this is the background that I want to set. Now I'm going to talk about a study. This is where things get interesting. So there is somebody called Elizabeth Loftus. She is a very important figure in this field. So Dr. Loftus is a cognitive psychologist from the US who spent decades studying memory, not just how it works, but more importantly, how it fails. So when she began her work, the prevailing belief, including among judges and lawyers, was that memory was largely reliable, especially if a person recalled an event with confidence and emotion. So Dr. Loftus actually challenged this particular idea, and she didn't just challenge it with theories. She proved it with experiments. So one of her most famous experiments is called Lost in the Mall study. So this is what she did in that particular study. She worked with participants' family members. So she did was she decided on the participants and she spoke with their family members and she tried to gather their true childhood memories like birthdays, school events, holidays, all these types of things. She gathered them all and she decided to talk about it to these participants. But while she did so, she fabricated an event. So, like that was when they were at about 5 years old. They got lost in a shopping mall and they were helped by an elderly stranger or something in those lines. And participants were asked to describe these memories. And over time, about 1 in 4 participants not only accepted the fake event was real, but added vivid emotional details what the stranger looked like, how scared they felt, what the mall smelled like. But none of it had actually happened. So this experiment and many other that Loftus conducted later showed conclusively that memory is suggestible. It can be changed, reshaped, even invented without the person realizing it. Now we can think of this in a real life scenario. The more you ask questions to a witness, or if you let's say you're a person in authority or somebody that they trust, and then you keep recounting, look at the power of suggestion there. How much it could possibly alter a memory. Now, in this particular case, or this experiment that Loftus had conducted, 1 in 4 participants actually accepted a fake event as real. And this was a study. So they had no motive to lie, about a memory because they did not know what it was going to be used for. If they knew also, they wouldn't Like, there's no reason for them to alter their memory or lie about it or anything like that. There's no context there like that, or no motive rather. But still, they believed it and they added their own details, they embellished it. So, Loftus's work shook the world of psychology and soon the world of law. Because if memory could be so easily distorted in a gentle lab experiment, how much more fragile might it be under emotional strain of a crime, police interrogation, courtroom pressures, and months and years of delay, right? So let's look at the real world consequences of this, right? So we're moving from theory to reality now. One of the most famous cases, this was a heartbreaking case, and this is easily available on Google and all of that because it's really, really famous, was a mistaken memory in the story of Ronald Cotton. It's not a story, it's a case. So in 1984, if I'm not wrong, in North Carolina, a young woman was attacked in her home. During this assault, she made it her mission to memorize every detail of her attacker's face, believing that if she survived, she would help capture him. Later, she identified this Ronald Cotton from a police lineup. She was sure. She testified in court, confident, consistent, and emotional. Ronald Cotton was convicted. He spent about 11 years, or 10 or 11 years in prison before DNA testing. So this happened in 1984, right? And 11 years later, DNA testing came into existence, a new type of thing available, technology available. So technology, this particular DNA evidence testing type of technology did not exist in 1984 at the time of this trial. So later, when this technology came into effect, it could prove that he was completely innocent. The real perpetrator, I think his name was Bobby Poole, had remained free. So she was devastated. The victim was devastated when she learned the truth. She had not lied, she had not exaggerated, she simply remembered incorrectly. And everyone, the police, the jury, the judge, everyone trusted her sincerity. So this case taught the American legal system a very painful lesson. Confidence is not accuracy, emotion is not evidence, and good intentions can still lead to devastating injustice when we misunderstand memory. Now, think about a similar situation in India, for example. Think about the number of cases where we have relied on soul testimony, and I've not seen a case in India where, years later, new evidence comes to light. I mean, not it's not particularly common, but in the US, there was actually a project called Innocence Project. I'll get to that in a bit. So, moving on, we can even look at a situation where not just one person, but an entire society itself could get something wrong. So here, in Ronald Cotton's case, showed an individual's memory loss, or rather memory failure, not loss, memory failure. But there's another case called the McMartin preschool case, how it could show how entire communities can create false memories. So this happened a little while later, not on maybe no, a little before, a little after, about 1980s, I believe, in California. A preschool teacher was accused of abusing children. As the investigation expanded, more children were interviewed again and again by police officers, therapists, and social workers. Different people interviewed them. Now, under this repeated questioning, children began to describe wild, impossible events, all kinds of things. There was no physical evidence, no logical way that these events could have happened. But these were actually children, not adults with motives to harm anyone, but actually children. And this case dragged on for years. I think it was one of the most expensive trials in the history of the United States. And it had ruined the lives of these innocent teachers. It traumatized countless families. I think the school itself was demolished. Ultimately, no one was convicted. The case collapsed under the weight of its own improbability. But the damage was done. And the lesson was clear. Repeated leading questioning, especially with children, can create rich, detailed, but entirely false memories. Now, why don't we look at something like this in the context of POXO Act, right? Have there been studies like that in the Indian context? There should be, at least now. That's my personal belief. Now we move on to the next portion. That is, we look at if there's an example like this in India. So first thought that came to my mind was a Malayalam movie, Drishyam. I think it was also there in other languages. Now, in this particular case, you could see the main character, the protagonist, sort of creating false memories. He helped, or he rather caused his neighbors and other persons to actually develop a false recall of a particular incident, um, based on the things that he fed to them, suggestibility, suggestions. So, and even each family member. So they internalize the story so deeply that when the police interrogate them separately, they recall their memories with complete conviction. They're not lying in the traditional sense. They've consciously planted memories and made them to feel real themselves, at least the witnesses. So Drishyam, that movie, even though it's a film, it shows us how memory can be built, rehearsed, and genuinely believed, especially under survival pressure. So if fictional characters can do this convincingly, we have to also look at the reality, vulnerability when it comes to real memories under real world trauma, fear, and suggestion. So let's start looking at other cases, maybe. Or we can even continue this particular discussion and get it into where law stands on it, etc. So I'm going to, or let's do this. Let's look at cross examination because that's one of the primary questions that come in when somebody talks about false memory. So people tend to ask, wouldn't this crumble in cross examination, in good cross examination? So again, cross examination is a tool meant to break down lies in a way. We could probably say that. But this is a real challenge. False memory holders are not liars. They don't really have bad motives. They truly believe what they're saying, right? So they come across as confident, consistent, emotional, natural, everything we traditionally associate with credibility. So this can especially be true in cases where there are sole witnesses, sole eyewitness testimony, or sexual assault cases, child witnesses. So false memories can survive even the toughest of cross examination. The person may fill gaps with invented but sincere details. They may resist contradiction not because they're stubborn or not because they're lying, but because their mind is locked onto a version of events that feel absolutely true. So, cross examination may expose liars, but false memories could possibly survive across because they are not lies. So, this is why courts relying heavily on oral testimony need to be cautious, especially in emotionally charged cases. So, how is the West dealing with this? That's again something that's really, really important. How are other countries dealing with this? So, one moment, please. My screen is frozen.
Otherwise, it was fine. There was no frozen screen.
Sorry, my screen froze, so I could not change anything there. I hope I'm audible now.
Yeah.
So let's look at what other countries are doing about this. So some countries have already started grappling with these issues. So in the US, experts like the one that I suggested that I talked about earlier, Elizabeth Loftus, she testifies in trials to educate juries about memory fragility. So some courts have also changed their practices. So in the UK, there is a guideline called the Turnbull Guidelines, where the courts caution juries about the dangers of mistaken identification, etc., when the only evidence is witness memory and so on. So there is currently something called a memory expert. It's just starting to work out. It's not really fully accepted worldwide, but they don't necessarily tell a jury. So we don't have a jury in India. I'm just talking about another system here, how memory works, how it can be distorted, how stress, time, suggestion can reshape even sincere recollections. So their role is educational, not accusatory. So still acceptance is uneven. Some courts embrace memory science, others resist, appearing it confuses juries. But this is happening somewhere or the other. Now, let's look at some powerful examples where false or fragile memories changed lives. Um, for example, the O.J. Simpson trial. So he was tried for the murder of his ex-wife and her friend. The case was some media circus. Witness memories were contaminated by repeated exposure to news reports. So Elizabeth Loftus had testified in this particular case about how post-event information, like media narratives, could subtly reshape what witnesses believed they'd seen. So in India, particularly when there's a very famous case, like a rape case or a murder case, we tend to have our TVs flooded with information. It need not be TVs, it's there in our social media, it's there on our phones, it's there everywhere. There's all kinds of medias, visual imagery. Sometimes they recreate events. Have you seen those notes that come on TV where they animate, they visualize, they use graphics to recreate crime scenes? Now, there may be witnesses who sit and watch this. So, post event information, that is, information that occurs after that particular event, like media narrative, could subtly reshape what witnesses believe that they had seen. So there are many factors in Simpson's acquittal, but Loftus's testimony helped the jury probably understand that confident memories are not automatically accurate. Then there's another case called the Stephen Avery and Brendan Daisy making a murder case. So here, he was wrongly imprisoned once and was charged again with murder. His teenage nephew, Brendan Daisy, was interrogated without proper safeguards. Through leading questions, suggestion, and pressure, Brendan confessed, but his confession was full of inconsistencies and signs of memory contamination. Memory experts had argued that Brendan's so called confession was actually a coerced false memory. So, forming false memories through coercion. Imagine that. Imagine the danger of something like that. Or there are all kinds of cases like this where people's memories could get contaminated through suggestion, through media reports, through what they experience, through what they think, and even their own mental health. Now, we always look at the insanity defense in the context of an accused, but do we really look at insanity from the context of a witness? I mean, I'm not even saying insanity, it doesn't have to be insanity or visually available, but how traumas would have worked on them, or how they might have other problems or memory problems that could cause them to shift. Now, these are questions that are put in cross examination. I see that. But at the same time, it's not a general rule, right? It can change. It's not something that the justice system itself is dependent on. Rather, it would depend on each lawyer working on this. But that's not correct, also, is what I understand. Because if memory is something this fragile, it might be time for us to rethink how we view memory, how much we attribute value to it in the present criminal trials. So in India, we have a strong traditions of valuing oral testimony. We have skilled cross-examination practices. We have standards like sterling quality testimony. So sterling quality testimony would have consistency. It would withstand cross-examination. There would be confidence. It would be genuine. It would seem genuine. But science tells us that sincerity and consistency are necessary, but they're not sufficient for accuracy. So maybe it's time to gently enrich our understanding, not to disrupt victims or witnesses, but to recognize where human memory can genuinely fail without anyone meaning harm. So when we talk about that, for example, in terms of sterling quality testimony, let's look at how. So have you seen in these cases where sole witness testimony, or like in rape cases where just one person's testimony is required? So let's look at false memories in that context now. So sterling quality testimony, like I said, um, let's say in Indian law, it's like okay. Let me try to put it like this. If a witness narrates events naturally, stays consistent even under cross examination, has no motive to lie, sticks to core facts without unnecessary exaggeration, some sort of a little bit, not like a parrot. So there are minor inconsistencies here and there. People do still accept that. I mean, courts accept that. But apart from that, if they narrate the events naturally, they stay consistent even under cross, there's no motive to lie, then it's looked at like even without independent corroboration, this is seen quite seriously. People can be convicted on the basis of this. But now let's look at science. Like, for example, Elizabeth Loftus' study and many other studies after that, where we say sincerity is not always the same as accuracy. A person can genuinely believe a wrong memory. Consistency is not the same as truth. It's not equal to truth. False memories can be consistently recalled across multiple tellings because the brain locks them in. And confidence is not the same as reliability. Trauma, suggestion, time gaps can all reshape what is remembered. So a person with false memory may still come across as totally consistent, natural, and unshaken in cross-examination. In other words, they could pass the Indian test of sterling quality even though memory is wrong. So in a simple way to put it, the legal test would be natural flow of testimony is reliable, but even natural flow can mask distortion. Consistency is equal to truth would be our belief, or rather the legal test. But false memories can be consistent. No motive would mean that they are reliable, but no motive, but memory can still be contaminated. So false memories can fulfill the legal sterling quality checklist while being scientifically unreliable. So this is a point at which I think we could possibly rethink how we see memory. So, for example, some courts have looked at minor contradictions that are expected because memory fades over time, but there's never really been an explicit discussion on false memories in any judgment, at least none of which I've seen in India. So, meaning this is something that still remains a largely Western concept. So memory expert testimony also is almost unheard of in Indian trials, but it's looking up in the West. Things are changing there, and especially with regard to Innocence Project. I wanted to ask if anyone here has heard of the Innocence Project in the US. It was a rather famous thing. So Innocence Project is a non-profit legal organization that was founded in a school of law, actually, Cardozo School of Law, New York, by two lawyers. And their mission was simple, but it was revolutionary. It was to use DNA testing to exonerate innocent people who were wrongfully convicted. So, alongside of that, they pushed for criminal justice reforms to prevent future wrongful convictions. So, why was it needed? Because before DNA testing became widespread in criminal justice, wrongful convictions were shockingly common. Innocent people were locked up based on eyewitness misidentification, false confession, junk, forensic science, prosecutorial misconduct, and crucial for today, unreliable memories. So these were all things that were pretty common at that point of time. That is, people were based on eyewitness misidentification. This can still happen today. False confessions still can happen today. Junk forensic science. Now that's probably changing a little bit. But again, we can even in India we can look at examples of narco analysis, how that was scrapped and not accepted. Why? There are different reasons, but still. So prosecutorial misconduct can still happen today. So unreliable memories, that's the core of our argument today. So Innocence Project proved that good faith witnesses, including victims of crime, could be completely wrong without lying. So how they worked is they re-examined old cases where DNA evidence was collected, but either not tested properly or not tested at all. So they advocate for post-conviction DNA testing. They provided free legal services to prisoners seeking to prove their innocence. They pushed for legal reforms like requiring proper police lineups, recording interrogation, and improving forensic science standards. So, key results as of today, the Innocence Project has helped exonerate over 300 people in the US through DNA evidence. At least 21 of those exonerees served time on death row. The average time it took for somebody to finish through this process for around 14 years. So this is a heartbreaking reality. So some spent decades behind bars for crimes that they did not commit. So what do they find about false memories? In about 70% of the cases they overturned, mistaken eyewitness identification was a major factor, which means sincere, emotional, confident witnesses who were wrong put innocent people behind bars. Sometimes these wrongful IDs were based on faulty police lineups, sometimes just normal good faith errors or human memory. The Innocence Project's work empirically proved that memory is not enough to convict. We must scientifically verify or risk sacrificing innocent lives. So there are several cases, like I already mentioned, Donald Cotton's case and the other McMartin case and all of that. There were other cases also. In fact, there was a TV show also, The Good Wife, wherein there was an episode. I mean, I know it's fictional, but it might help sort of juggle your interest in the subject, where race was a factor in terms of misidentification, how a person from a certain race may find it difficult to identify somebody from a different race. This was the context of that particular episode. I don't know the truth of it, but it's something to think about. So, what did the Innocence Project achieve systemically rather? So, it got laws mandating DNA preservation in many states, changes in police lineup procedures, push for recorded interrogations to prevent false confessions, greater awareness of codes that sincere witnesses can be sincerely wrong. So, All these were aspects that the Innocence Project came up with, which would tell us how fragile a thing memory is. So then let's look at what reforms we could possibly bring in India. What kind of reforms with regard to this? So one thing I understand is that maybe we can include into syllabus psychology, into legal syllabus, in syllabus of law, psychology as a paper, with particular focus on memory and studies on memory, as it is happening now, or the latest studies on the subject. So memory is fragile and false memories survive cross-examination, then what reforms should we suggest for India? That's the question, right? So one thing that we can do, like I said, is to change the syllabus, maybe not change it, but to add gently psychology as a subject, particularly psychology, that part of psychology which would help lawyers and judges or even policymakers at some point. And to probably train people also on cognitive science of memory. So judges are brilliant legal minds, but they're experts in law. They're not experts in psychology. So that particular aspect could be something that could be brought to their attention. So by trained psychologists, especially memory experts from abroad or those countries where there's a lot of research coming up on this area. But again, we also probably should have more research coming in the Indian context because psychological research can be different across populations. So we certainly do need research of that nature based out of India as well. So these types of concepts like confidence is not the same as reliability, consistency is not equal to accuracy, trauma memory cannot be photographic memory, etc. These are concepts that I think would help us understand and look at things more realistically. So this is one thing, probably like workshops for lawyers, judges, students, all kinds of people to show how memory actually works, if trauma affects memories, how suggestion can create false memories, all these things. So that judges and lawyers can all weigh memory evidence carefully and not automatically. This is also true for legislators. I think it's also high time where legislators thought about this sort of an idea. And it's not really happening around the world as fast as one would think. It's happening slowly. And we will see where it gets. Another thing is to allow memory experts as court witnesses. Again, this is something that's has the world divided where it is accepted also. So expert testimony is technically allowed, but in practice, memory science experts are never really used in trials. So reform would mean encourage courts to permit memory experts in cases where conviction heavily depends on human memory. So this is not to discredit the witness, but this is to show under what circumstances, what type of distortions could happen to memory, especially when it's old witness, eyewitness testimony, or when there's delayed reporting, or child witnesses cases, or cross-racial identification, and so on. Then another thing is to maybe improve police procedures like lineups or interrogations, that type of thing. Like in the US, in some places, it's a double-blind lineup where the police may not know who the suspect is. So children and vulnerable witnesses face repeated leading questions. Interrogations are often unrecorded. These types of things. Obviously, our system is different, and the confession to a police officer is not admissible. There are all kinds of things like that. But I'm trying to say that we have to look at our system and try to find out where memory may be seen as the most important thing, and slowly shake that belief to incorporate the changes happening in science, changes occurring in science. So another thing is in sole witness or sole witnesses memory based convictions, whether this concept can be looked into. That is the fallibility of human memory or how things are looking different in other jurisdictions, how more research has come about. So then finally, it is to encourage corroboration wherever possible. It's not mandatory, right? When the witness's testimony is sterling, etc. So, without distrusting victims, gently encourage to look for corroborative evidence. It could be other things like CCTV recordings, GPS evidence, medical evidence, all kinds of things. Why? Because humans can mean well, but memories don't always function in that way. So, I think these are all aspects that we can consider when we look at memories and false memories, that type of thing. And it's extremely important because think about it. we have the POCSO Act. It's an extremely strict statute. And children are, as I saw in the McMartin's case, children are prone to suggestibility. Now, we tend to think of children as very innocent and they tend to only tell the truth. That's what we locally, traditionally believed. But now science is showing us that children's memories are susceptible to suggestion. That if they are exposed to certain things, if they are media exposure, post event occurrences can shape their memories, can alter them. They can, bring about differences, or even discussions with persons they trust. Their notions can all shape children's thought processes. So when that happens, wouldn't we possibly be jailing innocent persons? So shouldn't such developments in science also be reflected in law? Isn't it time to do that? That is the central question that I would like to ask today. Now, with that, I'd like to wrap up my lecture. I know I said an hour, but this is an interesting concept, and it's a little it's a little underdeveloped still, right? So there's not much that can be discussed for over an hour unless I go into each of these case studies in detail. But this is something that is like a food for thought, pretty much, where we can think about these things and go back to them and see where we stand. So some key pointers to remember would be what false memories are, how they are formed, what are they affected by, what kind of persons are susceptible to it, what how is it looked at in other countries, developed legal systems as well. What are memory experts? What are they doing in other countries where their testimony is accepted? And we can also look at how legal systems are changing, guidelines are coming in, how each of these states within those developed systems are treating these things as well. Because India is a pioneer in several kinds of law. We are leading in so many different ways. So I think this is something that we can look at as well to research in this area, to come up with new laws if required. But mainly to conduct studies across the Indian population to see how possible this is or how our population responds to it, just to make sure that our system is more transparent, to make sure that innocents are not convicted, that type of thing. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. It was a wonderful, enriching experience. And as we earlier said, that we have taken on each area, and everyone should be enriched from that. There are a lot of brownie points to be taken up. And tomorrow, friends, as I earlier said, we will be having a discussion, not at 6 p.m., but at 5 p.m. by a sitting IAS officer, a present incumbent. One has already written very enlightening class, Mr. Rahul Bhandari, an IAS officer, plus KBS Sidhu, a former special secretary from state of Punjab. Do join us tomorrow at 5 p.m. Everyone stay safe, stay blessed. Thank you.